Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on partition of India in print media and cinema. Today we are talking about the diaspora's experience vis-a-vis the partition of the Indian subcontinent, how the diaspora, how the immediate cosmos of the diaspora speaks to the Indian reality, and how the socio-historical, socio-political changes, the new policies that shape Indian politics, how they transform the diaspora. So, we see that the happenings in the subcontinent have an influence on the diaspora, and the diaspora and its immediate cosmos is influential, is important, and play a significant role in shaping the aspirations and desires of the native Indians. So, although the diaspora is geographically away from India or South Asia, their experiences bear on the policies, on the lifestyle of the native Indians, the Indian citizens. So, when we talk of diaspora, there is a kind of the synonymity that is associated between diaspora and victimhood. So, when we talk of victim diasporas, we are automatically reminded of the Jews that have been persecuted across Europe through centuries. We are reminded of Africans that are scattered as a result of slavery all over Americas and the Caribbean. And then we are in the recent past, we also see the Armenians and the Palestinians that are displaced because of genocide and deprived of their homelands. So, diaspora is inevitably associated with sense of being uprooted from one's homeland forcefully. So, there have been a number of alternative labels associated with the diasporas, such as transmigrants, immigrants, expatriates are a few of these terms that are synonymous. So, transmigrants, immigrants and expatriates are some of the terms that are seen as exchangeable with the term diaspora, although all these terms have their own baggage, have their own history, and they describe in fact very different forms of population movements. We see that different communities or different generations of communities, and so different social groups have flourished away from their original homelands, and they have evolved in very different ways in the host land, in the land of the host country, and their reasons for leaving the home country have been varied, have been many. And so, despite this heterogeneity, despite this diverse picture that we get about the diaspora or the diasporian condition, we see that there are some commonality, some strong economic and political ties actually connect the diaspora. Regardless of where they come from, some strong economic and political ties actually connect the diaspora with their origin, and there is this tendency to often maintain a cultural identity, a distinct cultural identity in the foreign land. So, migrants always try to settle as discrete identifiable communities, and they send some financial support back to their families, to the families that are left behind, in the homeland. So, we see that they might migrate as legal or undocumented laborers. migrant workers or as skilled workers, but there is a tendency which is common among the diasporian communities, which is to send back some fiscal support to the family which is back at home. And it is indeed this dialectic connection of being, associated both with the foreign or the host land, and also keeping a foot back in the homeland. This kind of going back and forth between the new and the old home simultaneously, which characterizes the diasporas no matter where they come from. So, the role of compulsion, what made a person to move base to a foreign land, is central in identifying whether a community is in fact a diasporic community or its nature is that of a migrant. So, the actual compulsion is at the behest of the human agent. There are two major factors, one is the push and the other is the pull factor. By push factor, we are referring to the negative political climate that determines a person's decision to move away from homeland. So, someone is uprooted as a result of the larger political strategy, the larger political situation back in one's homeland, and that renders an individual a refugee's status. It is the push factor. On the other hand, one could leave homeland in seeking for greener pasture. Moving to a foreign land could be an economic incentive to find a better job, for a better placement, for a better lifestyle. So, the economy based migrations are actually categorized under pull factors. So, they are being actually pulled by the foreign land rather than being pushed away or pushed outside of the homeland. Now, in the context of Indian partition, we see that we have to be very in fact careful with the terms refugee and migrant. We have already discussed in our previous lectures that the two terms are similar. Many a times when loosely spoken, loosely deployed, they are interchange, they have interchangeable meanings, but not quite. A refugee is not necessarily a migrant. I am sorry, a migrant. So, a migrant is not necessarily a refugee, but a refugee is commonly a migrant. So, there are some overlaps and yet some differences too, and so by 1970s it had been the Indian policy to replace the terms refugee and displaced with the official word migrant. We see that the exile that the refugee communities experience is from their homes, as well as in terms of the lives that they are forced to reconstruct, the lives that they kind of set up in a new land. So, the original home is kind of emulated in the concept of building the new home. The original home is kept in one's mind while building the new home, and yet paradoxically one also inhabits a nowhere position, a position in between, which is the home cannot be really realized, both the new home and the old home remain equally foreign to the refugee. So, once a person becomes a refugee, that is a kind of a baggage of experience. It is a baggage that one carries all along, and although one is trying to carry a piece of that home and emulate the habits in the new land, in the foreign land, the distance or the fragmented identity is never quite reconciled. After coming back to one's home, one carries a piece of the foreign land in oneself, within oneself. So the identity becomes quite besides its original one. So that's something very commonly, discussed in the context of diasporian experience or diasporian sense of belonging. Populations that flee, conflict and violence across an international border in order to become refugees in neighboring countries, they realize that the abutting population, the population living just across the border is, starkly similar in terms of cultural practices, linguistic practices, even the culinary or gastronomic habits, the sartorial habits, the belief systems. And so, the difference has less to do with nationalism and more with the arbitrary boundaries, right. This is, I mean, we could think of the Punjabi culture on both sides of the border, the border abutting Pakistan today, or the Bengali culture on both sides of the border that is abutting Bangladesh. Similarly, the Tamil and Ceylonese culture, the Sri Lankan people's culture and the Tamil people's culture, they are very similar, and that's essentially the reason why this similarity actually in a way engenders some kind of competition, some desire to maintain uniqueness, and some kind of peculiar clash between the two populace, and this clash is being kind of spurred, it is being originated by the arbitrary borderline. The two people that are apparently very similar, but that also have to maintain some kind of foreignness in order to assert their unique, their separate existence. So that's where the competition is, or the conflict is coming from, and the conflict needs to be kind of maintained as a way of maintaining one's identity. So a new development complexes by the government are aimed at the diasporic groups and their assumed needs and desires, which are a set of preferences very strangely removed at several levels from those of the ordinary Indian citizens in the case of India. For many Indians within India, the NRI lifestyle, the non-residential Indian lifestyle actually shapes their desire. It generates desire, it is the curiosity about what's how the Indians live abroad, their experiences kind of shape the lifestyle back among the Indian denizens. It generates a desire, it becomes an object of fetish and aspiration, something that needs to be necessarily emulated. So, it is also notable, it is also noteworthy that a section of the refugee diaspora plays an important role in sustaining and transforming the notion of the idealized homeland, and they themselves are also shaped by the events and perceptions that are taking place within their homeland. So, they influence the homeland, and they in turn, their own identities are also shaped by the happenings back in their homeland. For example, the foreign policies that their country of origin actually adopt, the new government that comes to rule, everything play an important role in shaping a generation in the diaspora, right. everything play roles in shaping generations in the diaspora. So we see in the case of the independence of India and partition of the subcontinent, this cataclysm, this cataclysmic event, this watershed actually affected lives of Indians living overseas, and it unsettled long held notions of what it meant to belong to India. The cultural, religious and territorial ties were being revised, were being revisited. We see a primary reason being that they do not quite they do not quite go back to the same country that they had left behind. Perhaps what the diaspora, a section of diaspora had left behind was now a part of Pakistan, West Pakistan or East Pakistan. It was no longer a part of India. So the meanings of home also get altered in this way. Due to a new foreign policy concerns that focused on the rights of native Africans and also a diminished political use for Indians abroad. This is in the context of Africa, the African the diaspora in Africa. We see that the independent Indian government showed less engagement, less interest in the cause of the diaspora than its predecessor, the colonial counterpart. Once the diaspora stops receiving much support from their homeland due to altered government policies, the Indians overseas actually shift away from their Indianness, from their Indian identity and Indian belonging. So they shift away from their Indianness, their Indian belonging as their only source of identity, and try to redefine themselves in terms of the immediate context, the immediate cosmos that shape their existence, such as their positions as Indo-Kenyans, Indo-Mauritians and Indo-South Africans and so forth. So at the time of partition, we see that Kenyan and South African Indian population was engaged. Already they were struggling against a common oppressive environment, a common oppressive colonial other, which was seen as the only hostile force. So India actually served as a uniting force at that time, pre-independence and pre-partition, and it enabled the diaspora to define themselves primarily as Indians abroad who were against a common British other as well as against the local populations. So we see that in Kenya, in South Africa, the Indian communities were a small ethnic group and they were surrounded by the large native African population, and so the Indians in the diaspora hardly saw themselves as Hindus and Muslims. Communal divisions did not make any sense, they were less significant, and the question of race was on the fore. That was much more important. In South Africa as well as in Kenya, Indian populations were a small percentage of the whole, and so they needed to maintain some kind of united face against the hostile, racist, exploitative colonial regimes and other other antagonistic behavior in a foreign land, antagonistic attitudes in a foreign land. So partition and the loss of India as a united entity actually caused the Indians abroad to reconceive their identities actually through redefining themselves against through defining themselves against each other along religious lines. So suddenly one started identifying with their Hindu and Muslimness. For the Hindus, regardless of the location of their ancestral homes, they asserted a relationship with India, a connection with India, whereas for Muslims, there was a general tendency to distance themselves from India and refer to Pakistan as their homeland, even as their physical location of home, or the physical location of the ancestral homes fell within the geopolitical space of independent Indian nation. So, these were some of the tendencies observed during that time. The division of India forced Indians overseas to reconceptualize their relationship and reshape the relationship with the ancestral homeland that was now changing, that had now already changed, fundamentally altered. The division of ancestral homelands occurred along religious lines. And so, in Mauritius, for example, the partition of India did create new divisions among Hindus and Muslims. Although there went violent communal repercussions as we saw in the subcontinent itself, the divisions were reflected, communal or religious divisions were reflected in the political realm, right. So, it caused the Hindu and Muslim diaspora, Indian Hindu and Indian Muslim diaspora in Mauritius to move away from their ethnic conceptions of identity and espouse their new identity along religious lines. They became more ardent, more staunch Hindus and Muslims than ever before. So, the independence and partition of the Indian subcontinent created a kind of pluralistic and complex situation in the diaspora, with a layered and multifaceted notions, with layered and multifaceted notions of belonging and identity, which actually still continues till date. Now, we are going to quickly explore some of these works on partition, some of the works that revisit partition through a time space gap. We see that the Orientalist lens has informed our returning, our returning to the event, to the chapter of partition, and also it has played an important role in attempting to disinter India's glorious past, and so the Orientalists maintained an analogy with ancient European civilization and Indian civilization. On the other hand, we have the modernist tendency which legitimizes colonization, the colonial apparatus, by arguing that it enabled, it helped to civilize and socially improve, socially enhance the Indian culture. It made the Indian culture overall more progressive. So, on the one hand, we have the Orientalists celebrating the pre-British, in fact, the ancient Indian civilization, and on the other, we have the modernist point of view that kind of corroborates colonization, the colonial apparatus. Ronald Inden's Imagining India is a representational effort history which becomes a cultural political project, and it gathers a corpus of themes, images, icons and narrative forms such as travelogues, and acts as a discursive apparatus for constructing the other. So, in this imagined Orientalist and translated India, the Indian natives being being kind of deciphered, being unpacked through the European eye, through the eye of the white man, it implicated such a narrative voice was constructed through intellectual process, and it was implicated through socio-cultural relations that existed at the time of producing such a work. So, the ideological concerns and construction of India, for example, produced by William Jones, actually gives birth to or discovers Jones's India. What we see in Jones's writing is Jones's India, knowledge object for colonial writing. So, it is these kinds of works that have their Orientalist tendency need to be examined in terms of their method as well as the content, in order to determine, in order to basically understand the ideological status of the narrator or the writer. So, we see that after the partition, both India and Pakistan have produced an ewer of documents which all have their own biases, and yet they are all very useful in one way or the other to the historians that are trying to go back to the epicenter of the communal violence, back to the epicenter of communal violence in August 1947. So, for example, we have authors such as Muhammad Ali Chaudhry, we have authors such as Chaudhry Muhammad Ali writing in The Emergence of Pakistan about something that he asserts as the Sikh plan, the massacre of the Muslims in the eastern Punjab is something that Ali understands as a part of the Sikh, so-called Sikh plan. So, similarly, Mohinder Singh Randhawa and Bhaskar Rao focus on the epic story of rehabilitation. They produce official documents which portray the Indian government's stance and relay their agenda. Richard Simons is actually doing a kind of important work through combining insights from high politics as well as voices or perceptions from something that can be termed as history from below approach. So, he is engaging, Simons had engaged in relief work in Punjab during the 1947 disturbances, and his work, The Making of Pakistan, provides a lot of his own personal, it is shaped by his personal experiences, personal accounts. For both India and Pakistan, it was important to establish an independent national identity, and so they were creating their new national history and allowing and they were and the new histories were actually justifying the formation of the nascent nation state. So, we see in a lot of these mainstream historiographical works the glorification and dominance of great men such as M.K. Gandhi, Nehru and Jinnah. And yet over the years we also see how many Indian writers and some Pakistani writers have also been critical of these founding fathers, and they have more broadly criticized the Indian independence movements and revisited its different aspects. So, the 1947 partition of the subcontinent does not feature to a great extent in the post-colonial narratives, and so we see that there is a lack of its memorialization through museums. It is remarkable that unlike Holocaust, back in India we do not have museums commemorating or in a way memorializing the 1947 partition, and Punjab, Bengal and Kashmir, each chapter, each case has its own landscape of partition memory, and they have been in a way locally discussed but there have been no pan-Indian or governmental intervention to create sites or they recognize the violence on humanity through some permanent. So there has been a lack of intervention by any government after independence to kind of memorialize the human massacre, the human violence, the damage and injury caused to humanity as a result of partition through museumization of this historic event. We get a couple of autobiographies that are very important. Ram Manohar Lohia's work, autobiography, makes an independent analysis of the watershed from a socialist point of view, and then we have works by we have works such as Shahnawaz Khan's autobiographical narrative from Pakistan, which provides experience of his daughter Mumtaz's very personal transformation in political ideology from being a Congress follower to becoming a Muslim League supporter. And then we have Anis Kidwai's In Freedom's Shade, which recalls and recollects the mass violence, dislocation and rehabilitation efforts that took place in Noakhali, Bihar, Multan, Rawalpindi and Garmukteshwar. Similarly, Kamlaben Patel's work, torn from the roots, first in Gujarati and then translated in English, stands as a very important work. Kamlaben Patel was a social worker from Gujarat who was involved in the activities of Operation Recovery headed by Mridula Sarabhai, and they aimed at recovering and restoring abducted women to their families. So, Patel actually witnesses, she writes how the men would retort to the prospect of separation from the women that they had abducted. A lot of men would break down and burst into tears. Women would be sorely guilty on the prospect of being returned to their natal family, and they would try to explain their position. So, Patel's narrative all in all adopts a dispassionate tone while describing the different aspects, the difficulties of the recovery operation, which the author was part of an official representative, in which the author was a part of an official representative. She was representing the government of India in Pakistan. Similarly, we have Prakash Tandon's Punjabi Century, talking about a Punjabi family and how it qualifies as a memoir describing the dispersal and scattering of the Tandon family after they were forced to migrate during the partition. From there on, we see in the recent times some interesting works on partition coming up, such as Abdur Rahman Siddiqui's Smoke Without Fire, that seeks to recapture the memories of Muslim families in Old Delhi during the time of partition. And Siddiqui is very candid in his in his narration. He talks about the violence in the happening in the backdrop, and against this he talks about how, as a 23-year-old journalist, he and his friends were romancing with the courtesans against the backdrop of partition and the turbulent times, the difficult times it entailed. The Sixth River is full of wry ironic humor of partition, written by someone called Fikr Tonsvi, and this is the pen name of Ramlal Bhatia, who is a Hindu columnist and satirist based in Lahore. So, Tonsvi's ironic view shows how this absurdity, this absurd decision about partition actually renders a kind of speechlessness, a kind of deadlock and stop halt from which art, literature, philosophy and science, any kind of knowledge and scholarship and other emancipatory human endeavors found very difficult to re-emerge. So, Tandon and Siddiqui's narratives are nostalgic chronicles about a personal and family history. And Tonsvi in fact takes a skeptical stance with respect to nationalist illusions, and he refers to the risks that the writers faced at that time. He is probably talking about the question of censorship. So, without any self pity or nostalgia, Tonsvi acknowledges the climate of intolerance, mutual intolerance and hostility that actually marred the moment of celebration and self glorification, harbingered by the moment, harbingered by the independence. So, novels on Kashmir actually feature young Kashmiri men that are frustrated by personal and political oppressions, and they focus on the damage wrought upon a generation, or in fact generations of youth whose lives are consumed by violence and violence, bloodshed and murder. So, some of the best novels, some of the notable works in this regard are Salman Rushdie's Shalimar the Clown and Mirza Wahid's The Collaborator. So, in Collaborator we see women are minor characters and they serve as occasional reminder of the lack of any domesticity, any domestic life or domestic space in the rural sites of a war torn Kashmir. In Meena Arora Nayak's Endless Rain, we see the story of a radicalized young man named Ali, who ultimately joins the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front after losing faith in politics, and he does it as a means of securing a plebiscite. Endless Rain explores the story of Kashmir from the mid 1940s until early 1990s, highlighting the methods undertaken by Kashmiri men to gain sovereignty for Kashmir. The novel is tracing the lives of 3 generations of Kashmiri Muslim, of a Kashmiri Muslim family living in Srinagar. And so, we see in the study conducted by Ifat Malik, Malik states that only in this century have the Muslims and Hindus of Kashmir developed distinct communal identities. Originally, they were united by a common Kashmiri identity referred to as Kashmiriyat and formed a single Kashmiri community. After this, I am just going to refer to Tahnima Anam's works. Tahnima Anam, who is a trained anthropologist at Harvard, and she is originally from Bangladesh. She is writing her evers on settings, so her evers are based on events happening in Bengal, in Calcutta, and mostly in Bangladesh. So, there is a kind of curious temporal and spatial gap from the event of partition that she has to struggle with while penning her works on this topic. So, her major works, Anam's major works include A Golden Age, The Good Muslim, The Bones of Grace and The Startup Wife. A Golden Age narrates the story of a young woman from an aristocratic family in Calcutta and her tumultuous life because of the civil war, and she is married, and she is married and sent to Dhaka. So, her experience after marriage. So, the story actually moves between the two, back and forth between the two Bengals, the eastern side and the western side. The Good Muslim is important for its nuanced description of the challenges of the nation building process, and the realities of corruption and compromises are discussed. The Bones of Grace talk about an adopted daughter of a native Bengali family that finds herself torn between two worlds, her loyalty on the one hand for the motherland, for her motherland Bangladesh, and her American identity, her belonging in America, where she is completing her studies, and how she is trying to discover her existence through walking on a tightrope between these two kinds of two aspects of her being. So, I am going to stop today's lecture here, and let us meet again for another round of discussions. Thank you.